Jack Thompson was an ordinary man. He lived in a small house on the edge of a quiet town, far away from the busy streets and bright lights of the city. His life was simple. He worked as a mechanic in a small shop, fixing cars and trucks. In the evenings, he would return home to his peaceful little house, surrounded by trees and fields. Jack enjoyed his solitude, and his routine never changed. He liked it that way. One cool evening in early autumn, Jack was driving home from work. The roads were empty, the sky was turning dark, and the trees swayed gently in the wind. He was looking forward to a quiet evening, perhaps watching a movie or reading a book. But when he turned onto the narrow road that led to his house, something strange caught his eye. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, or maybe a car that had broken down. But as he got closer, his eyes widened in confusion. In the middle of his front yard stood three tall figures. They were not human. They were unlike anything he had ever seen before. Jack slowed his car, his heart racing. The figures were tall, their skin shimmering like the surface of a bubble. Their eyes were large, dark, and glowing faintly, like stars. Their bodies were slender, but they moved with a grace that made them seem almost otherworldly. Jack stopped the car, unsure of what to do. His first instinct was to drive away and call the police, but something told him to stay. The figures turned to face him as he stepped out of his car. They didn't say anything at first. Instead, they made strange, soft noises, like whispers, in a language Jack didn't understand. Their gestures were urgent, almost frantic, as if they were trying to communicate but were unable to make themselves understood. Jack could see fear in their eyes, and that made him hesitate. "Hey," Jack said cautiously. "Are you lost?" The tallest of the three nodded slowly, and Jack thought he saw the smallest flicker of relief in their eyes. The creature took a step forward, raising its hands in a gesture that seemed both pleading and thankful. Jack wasn't sure what to think. His mind was racing. Was this a prank? Some kind of elaborate hoax? The idea seemed ridiculous, but the aliens, if they were even aliens, didn't act like people pretending to be something they weren't. They looked and acted different, but not in a way that suggested deceit. Jack couldn't help but feel a strange sense of sympathy for them. They were clearly lost and frightened. All right, Jack muttered to himself. "You're not going to hurt me, right?" The aliens didn't respond verbally. They simply nodded again, their eyes wide and expectant. Jack looked at them more closely. They wore tight-fitting suits made from some kind of metallic material that reflected the dim light of the setting sun. Their faces were smooth, with no apparent nose or ears, just large eyes and soft lips. Their skin shimmered, almost as if it were made of liquid. Jack's mind spun. He had no idea what to do next. Should he call someone? Should he leave and get help? But who could he call? This wasn't something the police could handle. And besides, these beings didn't look dangerous, just lost and confused. "Okay, come inside," Jack said, shaking his head in disbelief. "I don't know what's going on, but you're clearly not from around here, so just come in." He turned and headed for his front door, and to his surprise, the aliens followed him without hesitation. Their movements were fluid and smooth, like they were gliding more than walking. Jack had never been around anything like this before, and he had no idea how to handle the situation. But he couldn't just leave them out there in the cold night. They needed help, even if he didn't understand what kind of help they required. Inside his home, Jack led them to the living room. The room was modest, with old furniture and a small fireplace crackling in the corner. The aliens seemed to study everything with intense curiosity. They didn't touch anything, but their eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail, as if trying to understand this new environment. Jack sat down on his couch, rubbing his face. He wasn't sure if he was dreaming or if he had just lost his mind. 3 aliens in his living room. It felt like something out of a movie, but it was real. This was really happening. One of the aliens, the smallest of the three, approached the coffee table. It looked down at the book Jack had left there earlier. The alien picked it up gently, flipping through the pages without opening it. Jack watched them, amused. It seemed like they were fascinated by the simplest things, like a human book. "Do you want some food?" Jack asked, feeling awkward but trying to be polite. He didn't know what else to offer them. The aliens exchanged a glance, then looked back at him, their eyes wide. Jack took that as a yes and got up to prepare something simple. He wasn't much of a cook, so he made some soup and offered them bread. As he set the food down on the table, the aliens hesitated, unsure of how to eat. Jack watched, trying to figure out what to do next. Eventually, the smallest one reached out with a long, delicate hand and picked up the bread. It sniffed it curiously, before taking a small bite. The others followed suit. Jack smiled softly. They weren't so different from humans, after all. They seemed to have the same basic needs: food, water, shelter. As they ate, Jack sat back and watched. He was trying to make sense of it all, but it was hard. These beings, whatever they were, had come from somewhere far away. They didn't speak his language. They didn't understand Earth, and yet they seemed to trust him. After they finished their meal, the smallest one looked at Jack and gestured to the sky outside, then pointed to itself. It made soft, melodic sounds that Jack couldn't understand. The gesture seemed to suggest they were from the stars, perhaps from a distant world. Jack had always been fascinated by space, but he had never imagined he would be face to face with beings from another planet. As the night wore on, Jack showed them around his home. He showed them the bathroom, where they curiously examined the shower and the toilet, as though they had never seen such things before. They seemed fascinated by everything, even the simple act of turning on a light. Jack went to bed that night, still feeling stunned. 3 aliens in his house. It was unreal, but somehow it felt right. They weren't hostile. They weren't asking for anything dangerous. They were just lost. And so, Jack made a decision. He would help them. He didn't know how, but he couldn't just turn them away. They needed him, and for reasons he couldn't explain, Jack felt an undeniable pull to help them find their way. As he drifted off to sleep, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this strange encounter would change his life forever. The following morning, Jack awoke to the soft sound of movement downstairs. He rubbed his eyes, stretched, and then glanced at the clock, 7:30 a.m. He had never been a morning person, but today felt different. His house was quiet, except for the occasional soft hum of the aliens moving around. As he climbed out of bed and made his way downstairs, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of unease. The night had been filled with questions and confusion. But now, as the daylight filtered through the windows, everything seemed just a little too real. 3 alien beings, lost and stranded in his house, and here he was, playing the role of caretaker. It was like a dream he couldn't wake up from. When Jack entered the kitchen, he found the aliens sitting at the table, looking at the food he had left out the night before. They were examining the bread and fruit in front of them, as if it were the most fascinating thing in the world. Jack watched them for a moment, wondering if they even knew how to eat human food. They had taken a few bites of the soup and bread the night before, but they hadn't seemed to understand much about how to use utensils or even why they needed to chew. "Good morning," Jack said, his voice still groggy from sleep. The aliens turned to him, their eyes wide with curiosity. The smallest one, the one who had seemed the most desperate the night before, tilted its head slightly and made a soft clicking noise, as though responding to Jack's greeting. It was clear they couldn't speak English, or at least not yet. But they seemed to understand his tone, and that was enough for Jack to feel a little more at ease. He grabbed a cup of coffee from the counter and set it down on the table, deciding that the first step was to establish some kind of routine. He had no idea what kind of creatures these beings were or how they communicated, but if he was going to help them, he needed to keep things as normal as possible. The smallest alien reached out and gently touched the coffee cup, looking at it. Curiously, Jack watched closely, wondering what they would do next. Slowly, the alien lifted the cup to its lips, but instead of drinking, it sniffed the coffee. It was a moment of pure curiosity, one that made Jack smile. Despite everything, these beings were just like any other creatures, exploring their surroundings, trying to understand the world they had found themselves in. Jack didn't try to explain how coffee worked. He simply sat down and sipped his drink. The others followed suit, examining the food and drink in front of them. After a few moments, the alien who had been holding the coffee cup mimicked Jack and took a small sip. Its face scrunched up slightly, clearly not expecting the bitter taste. "No, not for you, huh?" Jack chuckled softly. "It's an acquired taste." The alien seemed to understand the tone of his voice, but there were still no words. They weren't ready to speak yet. Instead, they watched Jack carefully, mirroring his every move as though they were trying to learn his habits. Jack wondered how much they understood. Was it only their curiosity that had brought them here, or was there something deeper? As the day wore on, Jack began to show them around his house. He started with the basics: how to use the bathroom, how to sit at the table, and what all the different objects in the house were for. It was a slow process, and Jack had to keep it simple. He pointed to things, mimicking their uses with his hands, hoping they would catch on. The aliens, in turn, paid close attention, never making a sound as they studied him. As Jack showed them how to use the shower, the aliens looked at him with wide eyes, clearly fascinated. One of them, the second, tallest, stepped forward and seemed to imitate Jack's movements, running their fingers through the water. It was as though they were trying to understand the flow of the liquid, how it moved, why it was warm. They explored every inch of the room, touching the walls, inspecting the sink, and even feeling the texture of the towels. They were like children, in a new world, trying to make sense of the strange things around them. By noon, Jack had managed to show them the basics of his home, though he was exhausted from explaining everything in the simplest terms possible. The aliens weren't just curious, they were keen learners. It was both amazing and a little overwhelming. They seemed to learn quickly, but it was also clear they had no knowledge of Earth's daily life. They couldn't even understand the concept of eating with forks or using a chair to sit at the table. It was like teaching someone from another planet to live on Earth. For the first time since they had arrived, Jack sat down and allowed himself a break. He sat on the couch, taking in the scene around him. The aliens were still at the table, quietly inspecting the food and drink. They weren't talking, but the silence didn't feel uncomfortable. In fact, it felt strangely peaceful. They seemed to understand that Jack wasn't there to judge them, and that gave him a sense of comfort. For the first time in hours, Jack wasn't worried about what the aliens would do next. That afternoon, Jack decided to take a walk outside. He needed some fresh air and time to clear his mind. The aliens, however, insisted on following him. They trailed behind him in silence, moving as one unit, their heads turning this way and that as they absorbed the world around them. The sight of them walking alongside him was surreal. He had always been alone in these woods, and now he had these strange beings as companions. As they walked, Jack tried to make small talk, but the aliens didn't respond. They simply walked along with him, occasionally stopping to look at the trees or the ground beneath their feet. They didn't seem to have any particular goal in mind. They just followed Jack, as if they were trusting him to lead them through this strange world. It was a bond that was forming between them, one that Jack couldn't quite explain. They weren't just strangers anymore. They were something more. By evening, Jack had grown accustomed to their presence. They were still silent, but it was no longer uncomfortable. In fact, he felt a sense of responsibility for them. They were helpless, stranded in an unfamiliar world, and Jack knew that it was up to him to keep them safe. He had no idea how long they would stay or how he could possibly help them return home. But he couldn't turn them away. They had no one else. Later that night, as they all sat around the table, Jack decided to try something. He reached for a piece of paper and a pen and began drawing simple shapes. Circles, squares, lines. The aliens watched him closely, their eyes following every stroke of the pen. Jack looked up at them and smiled. Maybe they didn't understand language, but they understood patterns. It was a start. The smallest alien reached out and gently touched the drawing, tracing the lines with its long fingers. Jack felt a sense of pride. This was more than just teaching them how to survive. It was the beginning of communication. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was the first step toward understanding, toward bridging the gap between their worlds. As the night grew darker, Jack felt an unexpected warmth in his chest. The aliens may have been lost, but somehow they had found him. And despite the uncertainty of what the future would bring, Jack knew one thing for sure: they weren't going anywhere. As the days passed, Jack found himself slipping into a routine with the three aliens. Their presence had become a part of his daily life, almost like a strange but normal occurrence. In the mornings, they would sit at the table, watching Jack as he made breakfast. They would copy his movements, trying to learn how to hold the utensils, how to pour coffee, and how to eat. It was a slow process, but Jack noticed their progress every day. They were learning, absorbing everything around them. Jack didn't mind the extra company. In fact, he found it strangely comforting. The aliens, despite being so different from him, didn't seem dangerous. They didn't speak, but their silent presence was somehow reassuring. It was as if they were trusting him, depending on him to show them how to survive on Earth. Jack felt responsible for them now, as if they were his guests, or perhaps something more. He was starting to feel a bond forming between them, a connection that went beyond mere survival. But as the days turned into weeks, something started to change. The aliens didn't want to leave. At first, Jack thought it was just a matter of time before they would repair their ship and go back to their home. But every time he asked them about it, they would just look at him with those big, glowing eyes, silent and unblinking. It was clear they weren't planning to leave anytime soon. Jack's house, which had once felt quiet and peaceful, was now always filled with activity. The aliens were everywhere, sitting at the table, walking around, studying everything in sight. They seemed to be constantly observing, taking in every detail of their new environment. Jack tried to go about his daily life, but it was hard to focus on anything when the aliens were always watching him, always mimicking his every move. One morning, Jack went out to the garden to do some work. He had a small plot of land behind his house where he grew vegetables, and it was one of the few things he truly enjoyed. He had always loved the simple act of planting seeds and watching them grow. But when he went outside that day, the aliens followed him, as they always did. They didn't need to say anything. They simply watched as Jack dug into the soil, planting rows of tomatoes and cucumbers. Jack didn't mind their company, but it was starting to feel a little overwhelming. He had never been good at sharing his personal space, and now it felt like there was no escape from the constant attention of the aliens. They followed him everywhere, like shadows, watching him, studying him, learning from him. It wasn't just the constant presence that was starting to get to Jack. It was their growing attachment to him. The aliens had become completely dependent on him for everything. They followed him around the house, sat with him during meals, and even watched him as he slept. They didn't speak, but their gaze was always fixed on him, as though they were waiting for him to show them the next step. In their strange new world, one evening, as Jack was eating dinner, he noticed the smallest alien staring at him intently. Its large eyes were fixed on his face, and it didn't look away. Jack felt a strange sense of unease, as if the alien was trying to communicate something that he couldn't understand. He set his fork down and looked back at the alien. "Why don't you go outside?" Jack asked, trying to keep his tone casual. "There's a whole world out there, you know. You don't have to stay in here all the time." The alien didn't respond. It just kept staring at him, its gaze unwavering. Jack shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He had never been good at dealing with silence, and the alien's intense stare made him feel uneasy. After a long moment, the alien finally broke its gaze and looked down at the table. It seemed almost sad. Jack's heart sank. The alien wasn't just curious. It was lonely. It was trapped in a world it didn't understand, and Jack realized that he had become their anchor. They were depending on him in ways that went far beyond survival. They were attached to him emotionally, and for the first time, Jack wondered if they would ever leave. That night, Jack lay awake in bed, staring up at the ceiling. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The aliens weren't just lost. They were lost without him. They had no desire to leave, no desire to return to their home. Jack was beginning to feel like a prisoner in his own house, and the pressure of their constant presence was starting to take its toll. The next morning, Jack decided to have a conversation with them. He needed to know why they wouldn't leave, why they had become so dependent on him. He wasn't sure how to communicate with them. After all, they couldn't speak his language. But he had to try. He couldn't live like this forever. He gathered the 3 aliens in the living room and sat down on the couch. The smallest one sat beside him, its eyes wide and attentive. The others stood nearby, watching Jack with silent curiosity. "Why don't you want to leave?" Jack asked gently. "I've shown you everything I can. You've learned how to survive here. You don't need me anymore." The aliens looked at each other, their expressions unreadable. They didn't answer him. They didn't speak at all. Jack's heart sank. He had hoped for some kind of answer, some explanation, but it seemed they were as confused as he was. They weren't leaving because they didn't know how to. Jack let out a deep sigh and rubbed his temples. He was tired of the constant uncertainty, tired of the pressure. It wasn't that he didn't care for the aliens, it was just that he didn't know how much longer he could handle this. He needed space. He needed his life back. But as Jack sat there feeling overwhelmed, something shifted in him. He looked at the aliens, at their glowing eyes and silent faces, and something inside him softened. They weren't just strange creatures from another world. They were scared, they were lost, and they had nowhere else to turn. And for reasons Jack couldn't explain, he couldn't bring himself to turn them away. I guess I'm stuck with you," Jack muttered, half to himself. He smiled weakly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "We're in this together now, aren't we?" The aliens looked at him, their eyes wide, almost like they were trying to understand. His words. They didn't speak, but they didn't need to. Their silence said everything. They weren't leaving, and Jack knew that deep down. They had nowhere else to go. As the days turned into weeks, Jack came to terms with the fact that his life was no longer his own. The aliens had become a part of his world, and no matter how hard he tried to push them away, they wouldn't leave. They depended on him in ways he couldn't fully understand. They weren't just visitors, they were family now, and somehow Jack had to find a way to live with that. Weeks had passed since the 3 aliens had arrived at Jack's house. What started as a simple act of kindness, helping lost travelers, had turned into something far more complicated. Jack had never expected his life to change so dramatically. He had always been a man of routine, someone who enjoyed his solitude. But now, his once quiet home was filled with the presence of these strange beings who were no longer just visitors. They had become a permanent part of his life. At first, Jack had tried to maintain his normal routine. He still went to work, Each day at the mechanic shop, still kept his garden, still did his chores. But it was no longer the same. Every time he left the house, the aliens were waiting for him, watching him. Every time he came back, they greeted him with their silent, curious eyes. They had grown more comfortable in his home, but Jack couldn't help but feel like they were getting too comfortable. The aliens no longer just watched him. They started to imitate his every move. They followed him around the house, trying to learn how to do everything Jack did. They sat at the table with him during meals, copied his mannerisms, and even tried to mimic the way he spoke, though they could never form any words. It was both fascinating and unsettling. They were like children, innocent and eager to learn, but at the same time, they were completely dependent on Jack for everything. One evening, Jack came home after a long day at work to find the aliens gathered around the kitchen table. The smallest one was holding a piece of paper and a pen, trying to write something. Jack smiled, a little amused. It seemed like they were trying to communicate, but they still didn't have the ability to speak his language. Instead, they were trying to write, probably thinking it would help them understand more about Earth. The sight of them trying so hard made Jack feel both proud and sad. "Still trying, huh?" Jack said softly, stepping into the room. "You know, I don't think words are going to help much." The aliens didn't respond, of course. They just stared at him, their large eyes full of curiosity. Jack didn't know if they understood what he said, but he could tell they were trying their best. The next morning, as Jack was eating breakfast, he noticed something different. The aliens were not sitting quietly as usual. Instead, they were standing by the door looking outside. They seemed restless, as if something was bothering them. Jack watched them for a while, his mind racing. He had never seen them act like this before. They weren't just curious, they were anxious. "What's going on?" Jack muttered to himself, getting up from the table. He walked over to the door and opened it. The aliens followed him, standing just behind him, watching the outside world, with a mixture of fear and wonder. The wind was blowing gently and the trees rustled in the distance, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Jack frowned. What was it that had them so on edge? He looked back at them, trying to figure out what they were feeling. "You want to go outside?" he asked, though he wasn't sure if they would understand. They didn't answer, but they did, step closer to him, moving cautiously. It was as though they were waiting for Jack to lead them. Jack hesitated for a moment. He had always been protective of his privacy, but now he was beginning to realize that these aliens didn't know how to live in the world. They were lost, stranded in a place that was both strange and dangerous to them. They didn't understand the rules of Earth, and they certainly didn't know how to survive on their own. They needed Jack. And Jack, despite all the confusion and pressure, couldn't bring himself to turn them away. "All right," Jack said, stepping outside and gesturing for them to follow. "Let's take a walk. Maybe that will help." The aliens, with their quiet steps, followed him into the woods behind his house. They didn't speak, but they walked alongside him, their eyes scanning the world around them. Jack wasn't sure what they were thinking, but he knew they weren't just learning about the environment, they were learning about themselves. They were trying to find their place in this strange world, and Jack was the one who had to show them how. As they walked, Jack couldn't help but feel the weight of their dependence on him. They had no desire to return to their planet, no interest in trying to repair their ship. They had no intention of leaving. They were content to stay with him, to learn from him, to depend on him, and it was beginning to feel like they had no plans of ever going anywhere. When they returned to the house that evening, Jack felt a strange sense of dread. He had been hoping that a walk in the woods would help them adjust, that they might feel more comfortable and less dependent on him. But instead, they had grown even more attached, even more insistent on staying by his side. The thought that they might never leave filled Jack with a sense of helplessness. He didn't know how much longer he could handle this. It wasn't just the physical presence of the aliens that was starting to weigh on Jack. It was the emotional strain. They had become so reliant on him, so attached, that he couldn't escape their constant need for attention. They watched him while he worked. They sat in the living room while he read. They followed him to the bathroom, to the kitchen, everywhere he went. There was no privacy, no space to breathe. And Jack realized something even more troubling. The aliens had begun to lose their sense of self. They no longer seemed like independent beings. They were almost like shadows, copying Jack's every move, following his every action. They were becoming more and more like him, but in doing so, they were losing their own identity. It was as if they didn't know who they were without Jack. One night, as Jack lay in bed, he heard soft footsteps outside his room. He sat up and glanced at the door. The aliens were standing just outside, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They didn't enter his room. They simply stood there, watching him. Jack's heart raced, and a wave of frustration washed over him. He was tired of the constant attention, tired of being their only source of support. "What do you want from me?" Jack whispered, not sure if they could even understand the words. The aliens didn't answer. They just stood there, silent and still. Jack let out a sigh, running a hand through his hair. He couldn't keep doing this. He couldn't keep being the one to take care of them, to teach them how to survive. They were lost, yes, but they needed to find their way. And Jack needed to find his own way, too. The next morning, Jack woke up with a sense of determination. He knew he couldn't continue like this. The aliens had to leave. They couldn't stay here forever. But how could he make them understand? How could he help them find their way back to their world without breaking the bond that had formed between them? Jack didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. Something had to change. The next few days felt like a blur to Jack. He had spent countless hours trying to figure out what to do. The aliens were no longer just guests in his house. They had become part of his life in ways he couldn't ignore. They were always there, watching him, following him, learning from him. He had tried to be patient with them, but now he realized he couldn't continue like this. They needed to leave, but the problem was, they didn't want to leave. Every time he hinted at the idea of them returning to their world, they only looked at him with wide, confused eyes. They didn't seem to understand that they had no place here. They had no ship, no way of communicating with their planet, and they had grown too attached to Jack to even consider leaving. Jack sat in the living room, staring at the aliens who were quietly studying the books on his shelf. They were peaceful, focused, and almost too eager to learn. They had come to rely on him for everything: food, shelter, even companionship. He had tried everything to help them understand that they couldn't stay forever, but no matter how much he tried, they just didn't get it. They didn't know how to survive on their own in a world so different from their own. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. He wanted to help them, but he couldn't help feeling trapped. His life, once so simple and quiet, was now filled with the constant presence of these three aliens. They depended on him. And while that might have seemed noble at first, Jack was starting to feel overwhelmed. He had no personal space left. Every corner of his house was shared with them. Every moment of his day spent teaching them how to live. Jack had always enjoyed his solitude, his quiet life. Now every time he looked up, the aliens were there watching him. They followed him everywhere. They mimicked his actions, asking for nothing but his attention and care. They had learned so much already, but Jack knew they couldn't stay in his home forever. He wasn't sure how long he could keep up the facade of everything being fine. That afternoon, Jack walked outside to the small shed in his backyard. He needed some space, time to think. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. It was a calm evening, but Jack's mind was far from calm. He leaned against the shed, taking a deep breath of the cool air. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on his chest. Suddenly, the aliens appeared behind him, as always, their footsteps soft but unmistakable. Jack turned to look at them, his heart sinking as their eyes met his. They were silent, as they always were. But there was something different about the way they looked at him now. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something deeper, something that made Jack realize just how much they had come to rely on him. They needed him in a way that went beyond survival. They had no place in this world without him. "Why won't you leave?" Jack muttered, his voice low. "Why can't you just go home?" The smallest alien stepped forward, its big eyes locking onto Jack's. For a moment, Jack thought it might speak, but it didn't. Instead, it placed its hand on Jack's arm, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. The alien didn't need words. Its actions said everything. It was showing Jack that they trusted him, that they saw him as their protector. They had no one else, no other options. Jack's chest tightened as he looked at the three aliens. They had been nothing but kind, but he couldn't escape the feeling that they were slowly losing themselves in him. They had stopped trying to understand their own world and had started to become like him in every way. They were starting to lose their identity as beings from another planet and were becoming just like him. It scared him, but it also made him feel a strange sense of responsibility. He couldn't just leave them. He couldn't just turn them away. Jack's mind raced as he tried to figure out what to do. If he didn't make them leave, he would lose his own sense of self. But if he did make them leave, he would be abandoning them in a world they didn't understand. They had no way to contact their planet, no way to return to their own kind. They were lost. They had nowhere else to go. As he stood there, the aliens watched him with calm, unwavering eyes. They weren't asking for much, just his care, his attention. They needed him to survive, to learn how to live in this world. And for the first time, Jack realized that they weren't just lost in the literal sense. They were lost emotionally, too. They had no home, no family, no people. They had come to Earth seeking refuge, and Jack had become their refuge. But Jack wasn't sure how much longer he could keep up the charade. He couldn't continue being everything for them. He needed a life of his own, one that wasn't constantly overshadowed by their need for him. As Jack stood there, he finally made a decision. He would help them find their way back home. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about helping them rediscover who they were, about helping them reclaim their identity, their sense of purpose. "All right," Jack said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'll help you." The aliens didn't speak, but their eyes lit up with gratitude. They didn't need words to understand him. They had always understood him without words. Jack felt a weight lift from his chest. He had made his choice. He wasn't going to abandon them, but he also wasn't going to let them lose themselves entirely in his world. The next day, Jack began to make plans. He knew it wouldn't be easy. There was no ship to repair, no communication device to fix. But Jack was determined. He would find a way to help them contact their planet. He would help them rebuild their connection to their world. Over the following weeks, Jack worked tirelessly with the aliens, searching for any way to contact their home. He had no idea how to fix their ship or how to use their advanced technology, but he was willing to learn. Together they worked in the small shed behind the house, trying to make sense of the alien technology. Jack's days became a blur of work and research. He spent hours every day trying to fix things, trying to find answers, while the aliens watched, helping however they could. As they worked side by side, Jack realized that he had grown attached to them too. They had become more than just lost travelers. They had become part of his world, and he had become part of theirs. After weeks of effort, Jack finally managed to get the communication device working. The aliens were thrilled. their eyes lighting up as they saw the first signs of a connection. Jack had done it. He had helped them find their way home. As the alien ship prepared to leave, Jack stood in the yard, watching as they made their final preparations. The aliens gathered around him, their eyes filled with gratitude. Jack felt a pang in his heart. He had helped them, but now they were leaving. They were going back to their world, to their people. "Goodbye," Jack said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll never forget you." The aliens didn't speak, but they stepped forward and placed their hands on Jack's shoulders. It was a final gesture of thanks, a silent promise that they would always remember him. And with that, they boarded their ship and disappeared into the sky. Jack stood in the yard for a long time, watching as the ship faded into the distance. He felt a mixture of sadness and relief. The aliens were gone, and his life would slowly return to normal. But something inside him had changed. He would never forget the strange beings that had come to his house, lost and scared, and had left with gratitude and hope. As the sun set that evening, Jack walked back into his house, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. He had made his choice, and it had been the right one. The aliens had found their way home, and Jack had found something deeper, a connection to a world far beyond his own.